Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. I'm very happy today to have Dr. Eliseo Chale Torres with me, a friend and colleague for a number of years. Since he was a boy growing up on the border of Texas and Mexico, Eliseo Torres, known to everyone as Chale, has been fascinated by the folk traditions and folkways of Mexico and of his Mexican-American roots. Both of his parents were versed in aspects of herbal lore and healing, and as he matured, he learned from them a love and respect for the history and folk knowledge of the ancient art of curanderismo, or Mexican folk healing. Now an administrator at the University of New Mexico, where he is vice president for student affairs and a member of the faculty of the College of Education, Chale teaches 3 classes on traditional medicine and regularly lectures and gives presentations on the history and lore of curanderismo to audiences ranging from scholars and students of Latin American culture to people hoping to become knowledgeable about alternative and traditional medicine, including lay people and medical professionals alike. He has published 4 books on his life and his research in traditional medicine, emphasizing medicinal plant and rituals, and published by the University of New Mexico Press and Kendall Hunt Publishing Company. So Chale, welcome to the show. So nice to have you here.
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Today, in part 1 of our 3 separate sessions, I'd like to talk a little bit about your personal life, your history in curanderismo, touching on some of the high points of your life, and if you could, maybe a takeaway for our listeners, something that they can learn about your life in curanderismo.
Well, thank you, Bob. Of course, I grew up with this topic. We grew up in a rural area of South Texas. My dad was a rancher, came from a ranching family. My mom came from a farming family. They met, they married, and we lived in a rural area. Our ranch was about 40 miles from the nearest hospital or health clinic. So my mom relied on using plants for healing, rituals that many of us practice now. And that's the way I grew up. She didn't consider herself a curandera, but she knew a lot about traditional medicine from her grandmother, or from her mother, my grandmother, should I say. She would perform all sorts of rituals on us and give us medicinal plants that would tell us, kids, don't you dare get sick. And if you do, I'm going to be your doctor. And she was. She kept all 8 of us healthy, fairly healthy. But my poor mom could not really explain to me why she did the things she did. And later on, when I started the university, one of my major professors, my mentor, Dr. Stanley Bittinger, whom you may have met, Bob.
Yes, I interviewed him.
You've been coming to the classes for a while in Albuquerque. You remember him?
Dr. Yeah, I not only did I get to meet him at the class, but I also went to his home and interviewed him there.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
In South Texas, yeah.
So you met one of my mentors, and he invited a group of students to travel with him to Mexico, and that lasted more than 20 years that I traveled with him by car back then. Mexico was fairly safe to travel by car. And we would travel all the way from the Texas border of Mexico and the U.S. all the way to the Guatemalan border between Guatemala and Mexico. It would take us about 3 days to get to the Guatemalan border. And on one of those trips, he said, you know, we don't have 10, 15 days to do the trip. I'm going to take you to a place close to the border by the name of Espinazo, Nuevo León, Mexico, where you will experience a curandero happening. I'm not sure what term to use, but it was a festival of sorts honoring the life of the famous Niño Fidencio curandero who died in 1938. I knew very little about this curandero. We went to this festival and it was just fascinating, Bob. It's like going back 100 years ago. People were still practicing the traditions that this famous healer was doing back in the 1920s, because he died in 1938. And I fell in love with this happening, this event. I also found out that one of my colleagues, Leo Carrillo, who taught at a neighboring university in South Texas, was writing a book and studying this tradition of Fidencista movement, named after this famous healer, Niño Fidencio. To make a long story short, Leo Carrillo, my friend, was a mentee of this, another famous curandero who was alive at the time. His name was Chenchito, whom you also met.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think that you got pretty close to Chenchito.
I did.
Hit it off with him.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Well, Chenchito, I met him. He became a mentor also. And this relationship of Chenchito lasted about 30 years. To tell you a funny story about Chenchito, earlier when I had come to New Mexico, I called Leo Carrillo, and I said, "How is Chenchito doing?" And he said, "Well, I hear Chenchito died." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes," but he was already around 65 or so. And I said, "Well, thank you for telling me." Well, fast forward about 5 years ago, I get a call from Roswell, New Mexico, and there's this lady, and she says, "My name is Margarita, and I have a healer here that came to see my mom who's dying." And she asked if we bring this healer. His name is Chenchito. I said, "I thought he was dead." She said, "No, he's alive." So I talked to Chenchito on the phone, and he said, I want to come see you. I said, "Well, fine, Chenchito." So I said, "Well, why don't you wait until our summer class that you're familiar with?" And he said, "Fine." I didn't think he would come again from Mexico because it's a long drive. He doesn't fly. Well, surprise, he came to my class, and he was a hit. You remember him.
Of course.
He was already almost 90 years old, a wonderful healer and the reason I bring up Chenchito is because he was able to explain the things my dear mom could not explain about plants, about rituals. And he became a wonderful, wonderful mentor. Unfortunately, in 2018, he passed away at the age of 90 something. But we are blessed, you and I, that we got to meet him, one of the great curanderos. And it's as if we had met the famous Niño Fidencio, who died in 1938.
Exactly.
So I have met some wonderful, wonderful people in this tradition, just like you have, because you have worked with Laurencio from Mexico for many years, and you've learned to appreciate what he brings to healing, because his grandmother was a great healer, like Chenchito was to me. Chenchito is, Laurencio is to you, I believe.
Exactly.
So those are some of the stories of how I've been involved in this tradition of healing. And I've fallen in love with these wonderful healers who give so much and receive so little. Well, they receive a lot of love, but they don't make a profit doing their healings.
Yeah. I was wondering if you would tell one or two of the stories. Now I'm trying to remember which of your books. Well, you know what? Can you give the titles of your books before I go on to my question?
Yes, Bob. One of my latest books. Well, let me start with some of my first books. They're out of print, but one of them, the first book was Healing with Herbs and Rituals. That's pretty much out of print. The second one was Curandero, and that's also out of print. I took those two books and I put together one book that's called Healing with Herbs and Rituals, a Mexican tradition. In this book, I mentioned three famous curanderos who are all dead. Don Pedrito Jaramillo, who comes from South Texas. He died in 1907. Teresita comes from Sonora, Mexico. She went to Chihuahua, Mexico, came to El Paso. She was exiled from Mexico by President Plutarco Elias Calles. I'm sorry, Porfirio Diaz. And she came to El Paso, went to Arizona, San Francisco, wound up in New York City, Bob. Can you believe that? Where she fell in love with a gentleman by the name John Van Order, married him because they say he was bilingual, knew Spanish and English. She was a hit in New York. This is the 1800s. Came back to Arizona and is buried in Clifton, Arizona. That's Teresita. And then the last curandero is the youngest. He died in 1930. That's 38. That's the famous Niño Fidencio. And then I write about the basic rituals, mal de ojos, susto, empacho, caída de mollera, a few things that you're familiar with. Mm-hmm. And then a list of plants that I adapted also and wrote later when I edited this book for a new edition, plants of New Mexico. Plants like Osha and other plants that are common to the Southwest and New Mexico. The second book is called Curandero, A Life in Mexican Folk Healing. I think that may be the book you're referring to, where I write stories about my life, about my mother, my father, how they practiced traditional medicine, and then about Chanchito, my teacher. The first chapter I call it The Awakening, when I first went to Espinazo and the things that happened to me that woke me up to this medicine, things that you can't explain, things that happened to me at this festival, this great festival that I went to many years before, but I went back after I had met Chanchito, and things happened to me at this festival. And about other things that happened throughout my life, and including some of the classes that I've been able to work with for the last 20 years. And then as part of the class, I wrote a book called Curanderismo, where I summarize many modules. I call them modules, but they're videos that we've taped. You're in one of those videos of many, many wonderful curanderos. And I take those videos and I form 2 online classes. And I call the book Curanderismo, and I add more information to this book. And the third book is Curandero, where I have bios of, including yours, bios of many famous curanderos. Some have passed on. They have passed on to the spirit world. Many of them are still with us today. And then in this book, I also write about curanderos of the future. Those people that are apprenticing right now, some may be apprenticing with you. The books, many of these books are now being translated to Spanish. Curanderos already in Spanish. And other books are being translated as we speak, because we also teach a course at the University of New Mexico in Spanish under the Spanish and Portuguese department. So this movement seems to be growing, and I get a lot of inquiries from all over the country and outside of the country about the class. And we bring a lot of wonderful healers from all over the world. And you've met some of these healers from Africa, from Peru, from El Salvador, from Guatemala. And they keep coming.
Absolutely. Well, I want to personally endorse your writings and say that I think I've read every word you've ever written without exaggeration.
Well, thank you, Bob.
At least in the books.
You've been a dear friend and part of this movement, so I appreciate it. And you've taken this movement to New York and to Long Island, and you've worked with several healers from Mexico, especially Laurencio. So
Absolutely.
Thank you for doing that.
Well, now if I could get back to your personal life, if you don't mind, Chale. In the book, the book Curandero, you described some experiences that you had when you arrived, and forgive me because it's been a few years since I read that particular book, but I seem to recall there was something along the lines of a pilgrimage that you went on.
Yes. That pilgrimage happened in the town of Espinazo, where this festival happens. So yes, I did a pilgrimage on the spur of the moment. It just happens. I mean, there's a reason for things to happen to one's life, and it was a wonderful experience.
Can you describe it for us?
Sure. I went to Espinazo with a friend of mine, Tim, from Austin, Texas. And one evening we were having dinner, and I overheard this group of elderly ladies talking about a pilgrimage to Bell's Mountain, Cerro de la Campana. And I interrupted them and I said, excuse me, I hear that you're doing a pilgrimage tomorrow. They said, yes. The ladies must have been in their, they must have been in their 60s, 70s. It's a group of about maybe 5 ladies. And I said, can I join you? They said, well, you're more than welcome to join us. So then they said, but we're leaving like at 5 o'clock in the morning. I said, well, I'll be here. Tell me where. They said, well, we'll meet here again tomorrow morning. Well, I joined them the next morning and they said, well, first of all, take your shoes off. We're going to walk barefooted. And they didn't tell me how long the walk was, but it was a lengthy walk. So we walked in the hot sun. And they said, we are going to sacrifice our body on this pilgrimage. I said, well, fine. So we walked for maybe 3 or 4 hours in the hot sun, and it is hot in Espinazo. There's a mountain range, and we got to that mountain range, and there's this, not a very high mountain called Bell's Mountain, Cerro de la Campana, where the famous Niño Fidense used to go and meditate, like the meditation of Gethsemane, of Christ meditated in Gethsemane. There's a correlation there. So we walk up this mountain, and we're barefooted, remember. So there's cactus and there's rocks. And we finally get to the top of the mountain, and my feet are bleeding, and I'm tired. I mean, the ladies are tired, and we get to the top of the mountains. We pray, we sing, we embrace each other, and it was one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. I've learned that sacrificing and meditating is part of the healing process. What I took from that trip to Espinazo was this pilgrimage with these wonderful ladies that I didn't know, but we bonded, we became good friends, we communicated with one another for the longest time. All of them have passed on to the other world, but the experience has been a blessing. I continue doing pilgrimages here in Albuquerque. I walk about 20 miles to Chimayo, where there's this sacred place, and this wonderful chapel and church in close to the mountains of northern New Mexico. And this is on Good Friday. I've done this for many, many years. My family and I do it. And this sacrifice and the pilgrimage have been very healing to me. So that's basically the story of the pilgrimage that I write about in Curandero, the book Curandero.
Well, I love that part of the book. I mean, it left a lasting impression on me. And I just want to touch on that takeaway, that within curanderismo and within world traditions that we can discuss, other world traditions, there is this central theme of sacrifice that we don't find as much in popular spirituality and even religion in the United States. You know, my critique of American spirituality would be that people want the shortcut. They always want the easy way. And where we have pilgrimage, we have hardship. And there is this underlying idea that through sacrifice, we give up something of ourself in order to receive something that's even more valuable. And I think that's an important takeaway from your story, and certainly one that we find echoed throughout curanderismo and throughout world traditions. And we'll pick up on this and some other things in our subsequent talks. We'll be having 2 more. So I'm going to encourage everybody to come back for our next session with Chale Torres, where he's going to talk about some of the messages and teachings from his most important teachers. So, Chale, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Bob.
This has been Cultures of Health and Healing with Robert Vetter. Thanks for listening. Please remember to subscribe and rate this show and share it with others. Until next time, remember, your health and healing matter, and you can find your own unique path to optimum wellness.